London. So I think we will begin. So welcome everyone to the May SHAC seminar. I'm Frank James, I'm chair of SHAC. And we've got Lawrence Principe as our speaker today. This is going out both on Zoom and on YouTube. If you're on Zoom, I'd be grateful if you could set your microphone to mute. Otherwise, it'll be done for you. Larry will talk for 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes or so of moderated discussion. If you're on Zoom, put your questions into the chat box, and I'll invite you to put them in person. If you're on YouTube, put them into chat box, and they will be passed to me. I'm afraid to say people on YouTube won't be able to participate directly, but just put it in chat box, and I'll ask the question for you. So, Lawrence Principe is the Due Professor of Humanities in the Department of History of Science and Technology and the Department of Chemistry at John Hopkins University in Baltimore. His research focuses mostly on the medieval and early modern periods, especially the history of alchemy and the science-religion dynamic, about which he's written numerous articles and 10 books, which I personally regard as extremely impressive. And those books include Secrets of Alchemy, 2013, and The Transmutation of Chemistry, Wilhelm Homburg, and the Academy Royale des Sciences, published in 2020. And he is just publishing, after 12 proof rounds, which is some sort of Guinness Book of Record, I'm sure, the Book of Light of the Great Magistery of John of Rupescissa. And that's what he's going to be talking about: alchemy, antichrist, and imprisonment. The floor is yours, Larry.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Frank. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who decided to attend this book launch. It's very nice to have the privilege of doing a book launch like this, because I think, finishing a book often means that one is so embedded in the details of producing it that the author himself often forgets what the book's about and what's actually in it. So to prepare for this book launch, I was pleasantly surprised by the experience of reacquainting myself with my own book. And what was kind of surprising to me was how many new directions and findings can come out of something that seems to a lot of people incredibly pedantic, namely making a critical edition of a medieval text. So just to say a little bit of something about this book itself, it is the third volume in the SHAC series, Sources of Alchemy and Chemistry. And this is a series devoted to critical editions of important alchemical texts, translations, and commentaries on them. So what I imagined when I started this was a short, rather fun project during the pandemic, which soon turned into an entree into a new world of insights and possibilities, and a lot of projects that I confess are going to keep me busy for the next 20 years or so. I can't talk about everything that's in this book, which is why you're going to have to see a copy of it for yourselves. But I will talk about 4 topics. So I'm going to start by introducing you to those who don't know this amazing character, John of Rupescissa, his life and his context. Then I'll talk about the process of making this book, of recovering his Liber Lucis Magisteri Imagni with a dual methodology of old and new. Old being sort of Lachmanian textual criticism to create a critical edition based on surviving manuscripts, and the newer methodology that I employ throughout, which is experimental reconstruction. Then I'll talk about a selection of findings, not everything, but just a quick selection of things that come out of this book. And then finally, the status of John's confinement, which I'll talk about in a moment, his Franciscanism in the Liber Lucis. So let me start with an introduction to John of Rupescissa. So John of Rupescissa, or Jean de Roquetaillade, was born in the village of Marcoles near Aurillac around 1310. In 1326 or 27, he began his studies at the University of Toulouse, and he joined the Franciscans in 1332. He continued his studies in Franciscan studia for another 5 years. Well, during this time, he had a dream that the Antichrist was born in a city called Zaiton or Zaiton. Now, since he'd never heard of such a place, he just dismissed it. But some years later, he read a letter written by a fellow Franciscan who was nothing other than the bishop of Zaiton. By the way, it's now called Quanzhou. It's on the Chinese coast of the Taiwan Strait. And John began to take his dream seriously as a vision. On the 8th of September in 1340, while he was chanting the Te Deum Laudamus at the friary in Aurillac, John received a sudden interpretive insight into the prophecies of Daniel. The Antichrist would come to power in mid-1366. After horrific persecutions lasting 3.5 years, the Antichrist would be destroyed by divine providence, followed by a 1,000-year era of peace before the end of time. And so John thereupon began a career of trying to prepare the church for these coming events. Well, the early 14th century was a tumultuous time for the Franciscans, especially in the south of what is now France. The order was split into rival factions, the most problematical of them being the spirituals. And this branch, which was eventually suppressed, sometimes violently, embraced radical poverty, apocalyptic prophecies, and viewed the more stabilized Franciscans as betrayers of St. Francis of Assisi's ideals. Those of you who are familiar with Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose will realize that it's set in the middle of these controversies. Well, probably due to John's affinity with the spirituals, he attracted the anger of Guillaume Farinier, the Franciscan provincial of the Aquitaine, who in 1344 ordered John arrested and confined in various Franciscan prisons, a whole sequence of about 10 of them as he was shuffled from one to the other. But in 1344, he ordered John, later, John ended up in Rieux in a brick cell under a staircase. And he was there for 3 years until the Black Death arrived in 1348 and killed off most of the friars. Now, John survived. He says he got sick at one point, whether it was of the plague or not, we don't actually know. But his survival may have been due to being in some kind of mostly solitary confinement. But John survived the Black Death only to be let out of his prison under the staircase and transferred to yet another prison. But John, who must have been quite a good talker, I suppose, convinced the friar that was escorting him to this new prison to take him instead to Avignon to see Pope Clement VI. And in fact, John appeared at a papal consistory in Avignon in October of 1349. Rather amazingly, we actually have an eyewitness account of John before the Pope in October 1349, and the aftermath of what happened to John afterwards. Probably the reason that this was recorded, it might not have anything to do with John, but while John was preaching before the papal court, where he called Clement VI the herald of the Antichrist and upbraided the cardinals for their wealth and forgetfulness about the poor. While he was still preaching, an irate priest from Montpellier came in brandishing a papal document that he had been given that the Pope had not fulfilled. He was angry enough that he threw it at the Pope, and the lead seal slapped Clement VI across the face. And so basically everyone is arrested until Clement, recomposed himself afterwards. So the next Monday, John was taken out of jail, and an inquiry started about his writings and his prophecies. Well, the papal court concluded that John was an upright, I quote, an upright cleric and master of Holy Scripture. And John was then ordered to write a full account of his predictions, and as a result, was eventually declared free of heresy, but not, apparently, free to leave. he was kept in the papal Carcer Soldani, or Sultan's prison, until just before his death in 1366. John's Liber Ostensor, that was written in 1356, describes horrors that he suffered in both Franciscan and papal prisons. For example, his persecution by Simon Leggett, an insane English priest who, among other things, according to John's report, constantly hissed "heretic, tick, tick, tick" at John, threw the contents of his bedpan at him in what John calls, quote, "a new kind of stoning," and nearly succeeded in stabbing him with a sharpened bone. Indeed, the lurid details John provides of his imprisonment have become some of the most cited features of his life. But of course, given his continued authorship, the exact form of his imprisonment has been open to question. At times, he must have had access to parchment and ink and a desk of some sort. And so in the third part of my remarks, I'll share with you the new findings my book presents, or new evidence at least, presents on this matter. Well, of John's 40 known writings, 11 of them survive today, and these 11 include 2 alchemical texts. The first, written probably in 1352, is his De Famulatu Philosophiae Evangelio, which deals with making medicines by alchemical processes. The other, written 2 years later in 1354, is the subject of my new book, the Liber Lucis Magisterii Magni, the Book of the Light of the Great Magistery, and it describes a process for making the philosopher's stone, the substance capable of transmuting base metals into gold or silver. Now, what you have to understand is that both of these texts are closely linked to John's concerns about the Antichrist. During the 3.5 years of persecution, Christians will need better medicines to survive, hence his work on alchemical medicines. And afterwards, the church will have been totally despoiled of all its temporal possessions, and so it's going to need gold and silver to rebuild. So John calls upon his fellow strict Franciscans to be the guardians and dispensers of this alchemical knowledge and its products. Well, now on to the second point. Although it was written in 1354, the text was not published until the second half of the 16th century, when in fact it was published twice, and under 2 different titles, with a highly divergent text. In fact, these 2 editions, they contain barely a single sentence in common. So immediately there's a problem. Which one of these 2, if either of them, represents John's original text? To answer this, I needed a critical edition. So a couple words about that process. So the first text was to collect manuscripts. When I began, there were 44 manuscripts, or to use the philologer's term, witnesses, of the Liber Lucis. Well, my subsequent searching in archives in North America and Europe brought that number to 106, which means that the Liber Lucis was a far more popular book than previously thought. Moreover, the text of these 106 manuscripts proved to be highly variable, much more variable than is usual for a medieval text. And I think the reason for this is that it's a rigidly practical text. That is, you had later practitioners who were constantly inserting their own laboratory experiences into the text, or perhaps, to their mind, correcting John's texts in the light of their own experiences. So the second task was to collect manuscripts, was to compare and group the manuscripts. Now, one of my main purposes when I started was trying to get an accurate text, what the philologists call the text, that is, something as close as possible to what John actually wrote while he was sitting there in the Sultan's prison. Well, it turned out I was also equally interested in how the text changed as it went through transmission into print. Well, what you do to form a critical edition is you group the manuscripts into families based on textual differences. So I'll give you one very quick example. It turned out that a large number of manuscripts, about 30 of them, have this strange opening that starts out natura seu materia lapidis, that is the nature or the material of the stone. Well, that varies from the other 70 or so that just start out materia. So here this word has been doubled. The original seems to have been materia. The others say natura or materia. And the reason for this is that some scribe at some point had a messy manuscript or a manuscript that had been rubbed. He couldn't read what the first word was. He wasn't sure. Was it natura? Was it materia? And in medieval abbreviations, that means either NA or MA. So that's very easy to mistake which of the two it could have been. But what that does for me is it means that any manuscript that starts out with the two words natura and materia must have been descendants of that one where the scribe couldn't read his original. So that allows you to group things together. It also tells you that that one of the printed editions, the first printed edition, you can see it there, starts this way, so we know exactly where it descends from. So what happens is that fortunately, these families corresponded to geographical regions. And so that allows one to define lines of transmission. And when you do this, you come up with something called a stemma codicum. And there's my stemma for about 70 of the manuscripts to show how they decide. Alpha up at the top is John's original. Those Greek letters at the top are things that are now lost, but we can postulate had an existence. And everything with Latin letters are, in fact, is still in existence. One of the things that this showed was that the Liber Lucis seems to have spread exclusively eastward and into northern Italy, and from northern Italy into Germany and then into England. Only one witness was produced in France, and this is odd. Why are there so few French copies? We know one copy produced in 1428 by a German student in Paris. But why did it not get into France? Well, here's one reason I thought of. If you've ever been at that bridge in Avignon, it doesn't make it to what would have been the French side. But jokes aside, the text's nearly exclusive movement eastward may reflect that it moved along the trade and diplomatic routes that linked the Holy See in Avignon to Italy and to Germanic lands, particularly to the Holy Roman Empire. That's possibly the reason. All right. So the fourth task then is we work backwards from the surviving witnesses to get as close as possible to John's original. I chose the best from each family. And then use principles of textual analysis to get back to a text. How do the printed editions compare? They're terrible. There's the final edition that you'll see in the book. The first of the printed editions, omits about 50% of John's original. The second, the printing, is a compilation of an epitomized, an abbreviated version, and a back translation into Latin of a vernacular translation plus additional insertions. So the take-home message from this part of the talk is, do not trust early modern editions of medieval alchemical texts. Okay. All right, so let's go on to the next thing. So let's move on to the processes here. So as I said, I tried to combine experimental replication with textual analysis. So let me explain the first step of the process. John tells you he wants you to take mercury and mix it with vitriol and other salts, heat it up, and get a snow white sublimate. The only problem is that if you follow the recipe that's in the Liber Lucis, it doesn't work at all. In fact, it can't. So if you go to John's other book, the De Famulatu, he's got the same process there. Interestingly, the ingredients differ. So you try it with those ingredients. Again, it doesn't work. So what's wrong? Well, this is a beautiful example of the alchemical principle of the dispersion of knowledge. You have to read both books, and you have to take the ingredients that are in both books and use all of them together. And when you do that, here's the mixture in a sublimatory. and you heat that up, then you get the white sublimate that he's talking about. Why did John do this? Well, one, it's a typical example of dispersion of knowledge in alchemical text. You think about it, John doesn't want the minions of the Antichrist figuring out how to make the philosopher's stone. So, so you have to compare the two texts. Did anyone think to do this? They sure did. Looking at those later manuscripts, we see many examples where scribes have copied out part of this process in the margin next to the text. Or in this one case of manuscript in Bern, here we have the main text is the De Famulatu, and someone has copied out John's other book, the Liber Lucis, the whole book in the margin to compare the two texts. All right. So there's our Snow White sublimate. Okay. Now, right. Sorry, I missed my place there for a moment. John then does something extraordinary. Now he thinks that this Snow White sublimate is the quintessence of mercury combined with the invisible sulfur or tincture of redness that comes from the vitriol. Why is he so interested in a tincture of redness? Because he's going to need that redness to be in the philosopher's stone in order to turn white metals into gold with gold's color. So that redness has got to be in there, but you can't see it. It's a Snow White sublimate. So why would he think there's anything red in there? He's going to prove it to you. And to do that, he uses what he calls an inganium. That is something that's it's a clever technique in his language. First, he's going to, and here's a little video for you. He's going to quench red hot iron nails in vinegar. So here they are being quenched. This is in my lab at Johns Hopkins. And then he's going to throw some of his white sublimate into it and stir that up. Now, the next video that I'm going to show you is going to be a time lapse, because what John says is after you've stirred this up, just leave it overnight, and the tincture of redness will manifest itself to your senses. Okay, so the next is a time lapse. It's about 8 hours condensed into a few seconds. And there is his tincture of redness. And you can separate the two. He's got the tincture of redness, and from the bottom of the vessel, he recovers the mercury. Now, one of the things that John says is he calls this ingenium, as I said, a demonstration to the senses, contrasting it with the logical demonstrations of the universities, which he dismisses. Remember, this is the 14th century. It's going to sound like it's a lot later, but he calls the disputations of the universities a great din of inane words and a clash of useless disputations. Right? Instead, here he's shown you to sense. Now, this process is very significant because, first of all, working in the 14th century, John should not have thought this analysis was possible, because according to scholastic Aristotelianism, when two substances are combined, their natures are entirely annihilated, and a third nature, a form of the mixture, is produced. So there should be no possibility of going backwards to get your original ingredients back out. So if you look at this whole chart, it's a synthesis followed by an analysis. The analysis, by Thomistic interpretations of Aristotelianism, at least, it shouldn't work. But John apparently was thinking in a different way. Now, historians of chemistry often place the origin of this analytical methodology with Lavoisier in the 18th century, and Bill Newman and I have shown that it shows up in the 16th and the 17th century alchemical texts as well. But to find it deployed in the mid-14th century is really quite shocking. Why did John believe he could do this and then use it as a demonstration of chemical composition? Well, there are several possible answers. I can't go through them all here because I don't have the time to do so, so I'm afraid you'll have to read the book. And so I'm going to skip through the next couple of slides, but there are several answers that open up some very interesting corridors for thinking about how practical alchemy was actually done in the Middle Ages. Right. The last thing I want to mention, I want to look at this mercury that John produces. He describes this mercury with a very strange Latin word, marcidus. This is strange. Applied to things like fruit, it means rotten. Applied to animals, it means exhausted, sluggish, or languid. But how could it possibly apply to mercury? So I was puzzled by this word. I thought it was a textual corruption, as did about half of the copyists who substituted a different word in for marcidus. It was only when I saw this material come out of the process that John's meaning and choice became clear. Now, ordinarily, mercury is a highly mobile liquid. It runs around in a beaker or on a surface, but if you look at what's in the dish, it doesn't. The mercury there that's been recovered from his process appears as tiny droplets that, due to dusty substances on their surfaces, they can't recombine into a mobile liquid, and so instead they remain immobile. The mercury no longer appears lively the way it should do, but instead marcidus, that is languid, tired, exhausted mercury. So this is a wonderful example, I think, of how the laboratory experiment aided the philology. Marcidus is not only correct, but it's a perfect description. I might have thrown that word out had I not seen this result in the laboratory. But it's a much bigger issue as well, because John could not possibly have predicted this result. I certainly didn't as a 21st century chemist. Along with John's many, many other exactly right descriptions of physical appearances and observations, these work together as clear evidence that John actually performed these processes himself. And that fundamentally revises what many previous studies of John have asserted, that the Liber Lucis is a literary compilation of earlier texts, not the result of practical experience. But John must have seen this that you're seeing in the dish there in order to use this word. And as I say, when you read the book, if you read the book, you will see many other examples. But this raises a new problem. John was imprisoned for almost 20 years. When and where could John have performed these alchemical operations if he was imprisoned from 1344 until his death? Well, fortunately, John helps us out, but very inadvertently. There's one other place besides these two alchemical texts where he mentions transmutational alchemy, namely his commentary on the eschatological oracle of Cyril, which he wrote while he was under that staircase in Rieux from 1347 until 1349. He says, "The science of alchemy teaches how to make gold and silver artificially from nearly every kind of body on earth, namely from blood, from plants, or from eggs, or from fruits, or from whatever sort of animal, or from stones and from all the metals." Now, this is enough to tell us that John's understanding of alchemy at this time, around 1348, was entirely derived from the Arabic literature, where almost any substance, particularly organic substances like blood and plants and eggs, should be used to try and make transmutational elixirs. But around 1300, a few Latin alchemists struck out on their own, declaring that the philosopher's stone could be made only from metals, and in fact from mercury alone. And this is the new kind of alchemy that's in the Liber Lucis. So by 1354, John had completely changed his mind. There's a period from 1348 to 1354, very narrow period, 6 years maximum, that he changed his mind completely about how to do alchemy. And where was John in those years? In Avignon. Meaning that he must have encountered the more up-to-date Latin ideas and carried out the Liber Lucis processes while he was imprisoned in the papal Carcer Soldani. So now we have to think of what is that imprisonment, what was it really like? Well, other historians, many historians, have already pointed to John's literary output while he was incarcerated as evidence that his conditions could not have been as dire as he describes. In fact, there's a lot of literary language that he uses. For example, at one point, when he's first thrown into a cell, he says, "Oh, I was thrown into a cell and it was had wet mud as the floor." It's possible that's a literary description, a literal description that he says the friary was flooded at the time. But the interesting thing is it also exactly represents or recapitulates what happened to the prophet Jeremiah, who was thrown into a cistern and sank into the mud in the cistern. So John, throughout his writings, is always connecting himself to the Old Testament prophets. Um, well, could one have really done alchemy in the Carcer Soldani? What was it like as a place? Well, one of the things we do know about it was that it was not in the papal palace. It was not in the papal complex. It was a rented house. So I thought, the one thing that the popes of Avignon did really well was to keep books, keep their account books. Are there accounts of the rent being paid for the Carcer Soldani? Yes, there are. And those accounts not only give us how much it costs to rent, but give us a very good description to show that it was basically a large medieval townhouse with a kitchen, with rooms, and so forth. With a kitchen, basically, John could have done everything right there without leaving the building. And because some of the space seems to have been communal, which aligns with John's own descriptions, he still could have been subjected to the lunatic Simon Leggett. So, my sense is that John was kept around in Avignon. I think it was a kind of he was probably not allowed to leave Avignon, but he could leave the Carcer Soldani when he needed to. We know that he went and he talked to a cardinal in his private apartments. We know that a physician had dinner with him in the prison, which, if you're thinking about a physician having a dinner in a prison, if it's as terrible as John describes, it doesn't sound very palatable. Anyway, so I see I'm out of time here, so I'm just going to leave you with one last line of John's text, the last line, which does not appear in the printed editions. This is only in the critical edition now. He ends by saying, "Behold the marvelous techniques," here are his ingenia, "openly revealed now in this very time of present tribulation, which in other generations were unknown to the sons of men, just as they are now given to be known to the faithful poor ones, sons of the Holy Roman Church." Here now we have a very strong, this line, it takes me many pages in the book to unpack everything that's in this line. And again, I can't do that here. It's a concentrated expression of how important John's alchemy was in relation to his eschatology, in relation to his theology, and in the role he thought he would play in the post-apocalyptic church with alchemy. So with this as the end of his text, this very important line, which again I say is not in the printed edition, I think it's a good place for me to bring my own remarks about this book to an end. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. That was absolutely super, and I'm now really, really looking forward to reading the text when it arrives. Right, so we've got time for questions. If you've got a question, put a hand up or put something in the chat box, and chat box also for YouTube. But I'm going to sort of exercise my usual chair's prerogative and ask the first question. You've described at the beginning a sort of fairly chaotic religious situation in the south of France at the time, and the word Cathar kept going through my mind when you were doing that. Though I know that's a sort of century or so earlier, but they did sort of survive into the 14th century, and I sort of wonder if that sort of historical context that's described in Montelou, for example, has any impact on what John gets up to and his ideology and so on and so on.
Well, I think the Franciscans of John's era had enough trouble dealing with the problems within the order without worrying about the Cathars. But it's certainly right to say that the kind of issues with heresy in the Occitan region of what's now France did set a stage. I mean, that's where the Dominicans did so much of their work early on, and the Dominicans, whose basic function was to combat heresy, did so much of their work. So the south of France, it's a troubled region. It's a fascinating region, but it was a troubled region. And I think certainly the Franciscan administrators were very, very concerned about more and more problems breaking out in particularly that area, whether it was influence from earlier theological unorthodoxies or new ones. It was seriously a problem.
Okay. So I haven't had any other hands or queries put up, so I'll ask another question. We can have you just have a conversation. I was amazed at 106 different versions of this manuscript. That, I mean, to somebody who's not a medievalist or early modernist, that strikes me as being a really high number of manuscripts. I'm just wondering how typical or untypical that is of alchemical text, or indeed any other sort of text at that time.
Right, for an alchemical text of the 14th century, that is a very large number. It kept being read and copied down to the 17th century, even after the printed editions were produced. Out of that 106, if I remember correctly, I think only about 8 to 10 are actually copied from one or the other printed editions. So you have lots of variations. What strikes me is that, first of all, it's being translated, I think, into 7 or 8 languages, and the translations happen pretty early. If there are 106 surviving now, the question is, how many of them were there, say, by the end of the 15th century? In 1600, if we could have done a census then, without all the disruptions of the continent that have happened since then, how many would there have been? There would have been certainly over 1,000, I would think. So that is unusual. So it was a highly circulated text. What's even more interesting is how much use it got, because these are not beautiful, professionally produced copies in general. They're usually done by practitioners. So they're rather rough and ready. They're on paper. Only about 7% of them are beautiful, that is, on parchment by a professional scribe. And the margins tend to be very full of scribbles. There's a whole section, there's a whole family of them where there are glosses that have been inserted into the text by later practitioners. In fact, 2 or 3 generations of later practitioners constantly commenting on the work, giving new ideas about how to make a certain process work, recording their success or their lack of success. So the whole story of the manuscripts is a really interesting one that I spend a lot of time on in the book. I should say,
I can see that from that family tree. I mean, that's quite an incredible piece of work.
I should say that I've set myself up for even more problems because now I'm starting work on John's other work, the De Famulatu. It's generally called De Quintessentia. But once you start looking at the manuscripts, you find that that's the title that comes to us from the printed edition. And it's very misleading. The correct title is not On the Quintessence. The correct title is On the Service of Philosophy to the Gospel of Jesus Christ. So that immediately puts the whole book in a different perspective. In that case, there are even more copies. I've now found 256 copies of it, which is something quite extraordinary. The interesting thing there is there are a lot more professional copies. About 35% so far are expensive copies. And I think the reason for that is it's medical, and doctors could hire a professional scribe and afford the parchment. And they may have become shelf furniture for them rather than used books. They're not used as much as the Liber Lucis is, which was really a down and dirty in the lab book.
Okay, right. So people have started asking questions, and I've got 3 of them now. The first is from Yasmin Akea. Would you like to ask that question? If you could unmute yourself. Right. Yasmin, could you unmute yourself? Okay, the answer appears to be no. So I'll read the question from chat. Your talk shows that experimental reconstruction can actually correct or illuminate philological interpretation. For example, in the case of much dust. Do you think this combined method of philology and laboratory reconstruction could be applied to the Arabic alchemical tradition, especially the Jabarian corpus? And if so, how should we avoid reading these texts anachronistically as early modern experimental science?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think one of the things that's important for me to say about the work with experimental reconstruction is that it can never get far from the library. That is, there's got to be a dialogue between the textual source and what you see in the lab. Otherwise, either we'll be misled by our difficulties with textual transmission, or we'll go off on our own imaginations in the laboratory of what might have been going on. So there has to be this really close dialogue between the two. In terms of the Arabic material, yes, absolutely. I think that would be very, very useful as well. I mean, we have problems just with Latin texts and particularly technical terms in Latin texts, but we have often an even greater problem with the Arabic materials. Often they're in fewer copies. We don't have as many copies. I was very lucky to have as many copies as I did of my text. So sure, I think it would be tremendously useful. Also, the other thing that one has to talk about when talking about experimental recreations would be getting the right materials. We can't just go and to the laboratory stockroom and pick up a bottle of a chemical and expect that it represents accurately what our medieval, whether Latin or Arabic authors were actually using. So things have to be localized in a time and place as well. And it may, in fact, help us understand a little bit more about what was actually on an Arabic alchemist's shelf in terms of where did things come from and what were they actually like.
I mean, that also applies to sort of more modern periods, because there's been quite a lot of work to reproduce early photography, and they found that using pure chemical elements simply doesn't cut it.
It doesn't cut it. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
The next two are from the YouTube feed, so I'll read them out. The first is from Peter Ramberg. Great talk. I can't remember the specific timeline, but is there any connection or relation to Gerber's Summa Perfectionis? Gerber emphasizes the importance of metals in making the philosopher's stone.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I can say very confidently that John of Rupescissa did read Geber's Summa Perfectionis. There are a few lines, a few turns of phrase in the Liber Lucis that seem to come directly from it. We're not exactly sure of when the Summa Perfectionis was actually written. End of the from about end of the 13th century, beginning of the 14th century, sometime around there. So it had been in circulation for 50 to 60 years before John started writing.
Okay. And the next question is from Ellen Hausner. I'm wondering about the other surviving texts John wrote which were not alchemical. What were their subjects, and were any of them useful for understanding John's attitude towards alchemy?
Right. Yes, most of the other ones were prophetic works or theological works. So, as I say, there are 9 of those. Many of them have benefited from critical editions right now. So there is the book that he was asked to write by the papal commission that was investigating him, the Liber Secretorum Eventuum, the book of the book of the secrets of things to come. That's present in a very nice critical edition. So mostly they're prophetic works, a few short letters that he wrote to people. Um, in terms of helping with the alchemy, I did use his commentary on the Oracle of Cyril because he fortunately does mention alchemy there. He's also got a very interesting section in there, a very, very long, very detailed part about the assaying of gold and silver, where he refers to a book which I'm very sorry to say is lost, which is called his book on the revelation of secrets in the weights of things. Now, what that book was, we only know that he wrote it in the Aquitanian dialect of Occitan, that he wrote it in 3 books at the request of a friend, and it was about testing of metals. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we actually could find that book or some more sections out of it? So it seems that John may have practiced metal refining and metal assaying. In fact, he's one of the first people in the De Famulatu that he writes in Avignon to describe the purification of gold-silver alloys using mineral acids. That's actually a section that doesn't make it into the printed edition. Again, it's only in the manuscripts of that work. But that's the only place where he really talks very much more about his practical knowledge of anything that could be called alchemy. It'd be nice if there were more. I'll mention just in passing the miracle of the discovery of the 11th of John's surviving manuscripts, which was discovered about 20 years ago, the sole surviving manuscript in the bottom of an armoire in a country house in Nancy. And that's now being made into a critical edition by some scholars in Paris.
Yes, one does vaguely wonder what is sort of still to be found. I mean, many medieval manuscripts are still coming through. I mean, it is actually interesting that some don't survive. One survives only in 1 copy, and you've got 106 of this. I mean, is it just sort of historical contingency, or is something else? Is there a more causal element going on there?
Would love to know the answer to that. It is very strange. The only other example I can give you is there's a book by someone we don't know who he was, by the name, goes under the name Marius, on the elements. And it seems everybody I read is citing out of it, often silently without mentioning where they're getting their citations from. So it looks like it was very, very widespread, yet there are only 2 copies in existence today. How did that happen?
Yeah. Okay, so Yasmin's responded to your earlier answer. Thank you very much for this fascinating and stimulating talk. I especially appreciated your point that experimental reconstruction must take seriously the historical specificity of materials, not just the textual recipe itself.
Absolutely.
And then we've got a new question again from YouTube, so I'll read it out from Sophie Brooks. Rupescissa often writes as though Europe were approaching catastrophic collapse. How much of his alchemical program was intended as a survival technology for the faithful?
Absolutely. It's totally a survival strategy. He says he talks about all kinds of things in the De Famulatu. He talks about, well, if you need to move money so the Antichrist won't find it, just mix your gold with mercury and it'll look like dirt, and then you can mix it with dirt and put it in a wagon and no one will know you're transporting gold. The medicines there, both his new quintessential medicines and his remedies, are basically for Franciscans, the true Franciscans, his true men of the gospel, as he calls them, the viri evangelici, to tend to the faithful during the persecutions of the Antichrist. The Liber Lucis, he's very explicit about this. In 3.5 years, the Antichrist will have taken away all of the church's temporal possessions. He's also very clear that the Antichrist will be absolutely destroyed by divine providence in 3.5 years. And that's when these viri evangelici, the true Franciscans, can then make the philosopher's stone, generate gold and silver, rebuild the church, but rebuild the church better into a kind of church the way St. Francis wanted it to be, not with wealthy prelates, let's say.
Yeah. I can see that going down well with the Pope. But I mean that sort of prompts me to sort of go back to sort of the sort of theological religious chaos in this period, in this place, and these sort of millennials, because they do tend to come out at times of enormous stress. So you get a lot of millennials in the Civil War in England. You get a lot, and in my own period, you get a lot of millennials coming out during the Napoleonic Wars because of the sort of grave threat, as people saw it, from the French in Britain. And you certainly see it to a lesser extent in the 1940s, when Britain was under attack from the Nazis. And I mean, that's epitomized by that sort of super photograph of St. Paul's Cathedral not being bombed, but bombs falling all around. That's sort of seen as some sort of divine intervention, as Dunkirk was also seen as divine intervention. So I suppose the question there is, do you see these sort of millennial phenomena coming at times of great political, religious stress?
Yeah, often this is the case. John has his own particular twist on it, of course. He is unlike many sort of prophets of things to come. He is incredibly specific about who's going to do what to whom and when. And so even though he's claiming that his insights come from the interpretation of sacred scripture, it would have been, how should we put it? It would have been unwise, in fact, dangerous of him to imply that he was getting direct revelations from God. That's a no-go in medieval theology. It's amazing that he's apparently watching the signs of the times and picking on specific people, Louis of Sicily and so forth, that are going to play key roles in all of this. It does seem, due to the work of Robert Lerner on John and his prophetic works, John does seem to be the first person who interpreted the millennium as a literal 1,000 years of the last times. So he does think that he does predict that the world will find the last judgment will occur in 2380, 2370, sorry, 2370.
We won't get there.
You know, well, that's the sad part of it. John didn't either, because we know that his last few months of life, he was being supported by Pope Urban V, cared for in the Franciscan friary in Avignon, the Pope paying his expenses. And apparently the last record of the bookkeeping is for January of 1366. So in other words, he died just about 4 months before he could have found out whether his predictions would have been right or not.
Okay. Rob, you've got a question.
Yeah, it just seems to me that if this was a survival manual, it might explain the numbers of copies that exist.
Right, except for one little problem, that we don't have any 14th century copies. They seem to have been used to death. Already by the earliest copies we have are probably from the first decade of the 15th century. By that point, it's already been so heavily used that it's separated into 6 distinct families by that point. And there are some people who seem to realize that, oops, the prophecies didn't quite come true. So things get inserted, like in the prologue, when John writes, we know that the Antichrist, something to the effect of the Antichrist persecutions, and then someone in a whole bunch of copies writes in, unless God out of his mercy will delay the time of his coming. So that might have, I'm guessing that probably came from a Franciscan writer that, was thinking it was still coming, but not quite yet. But, the interest in making gold and silver is a pretty perennial one.
Yeah.
And John is one of the he's unusually clear, with secrets, of course, but unusually clear. So he gives you a place to start, which is enticing, let's say.
Right. Right. Okay. Thank you.
So, going back to the millennium and the Franciscans, I mean, I was very struck when I sort of went round Italy looking at sites associated with St. Francis, which implied pretty strongly that he was a sort of second coming of Christ, sort of being born poor in a stable and so on. The sort of comparisons with Christ were pretty explicit, and that sort of leads me to wonder about this sort of Pope in Avignon and the sort of whole papal problems, and how that might have affected his life and work.
Yeah, well, one of the questions is, why was he kept in Avignon in the first place? Why didn't the Pope just say, oh, it's another crazy Franciscan, get rid of him? And there's an excellent article on this by Robert Lerner over why the Pope seems to actually have been interested in him. Well, think of what was going on. Clement VI, the Black Plague had gotten so bad, Clement VI had just declared the Rhone River to be hallowed ground so that people could throw plague victims into it without having to bury them. There had just been a tremendous earthquake in Switzerland that changed the course of the Rhine River. There was widespread famine. I mean, it was a terrible time, to show up. And here, all of a sudden, the Pope is sitting there in Avignon, and in comes this Franciscan saying he has answers to what's going to happen. And it seems that the Pope was actually interested, and the cardinals were too. So my guess is that John was not, and this is more than a guess, which I'll say in a moment. John was kept around in prison, not as a punishment, but under a kind of protective custody, so that the Pope could learn more about what was going on. And we know that this, in fact, happened. We know that cardinals came to ask John questions often. The notarial document that I mentioned, the eyewitness account of his confrontation with the Pope, it ends with the line that he was kept around, and the exact wording is, so that even greater things may be found out by him, with the idea that John is going to be a source of information the popes might very well need.
Excellent. So I've got two more questions. I think we'll sort of draw a line at the end. So Sophie Books again. Do you think John's doctrine of the Quinta Essentia implies existence of universal seminal principle in matter, something analogous to what later alchemists would call the seed of metals?
Right. I don't think so. What he actually meant by the quintessence is something I'm working on now, but I have to get a really good, reliable text of that book in order to say anything definitive. It's often been said that the quintessence is related to the fifth element in Aristotle. It does not seem to be that from the good copies of the manuscripts I've been able to access. But I'm going to have to hold off on saying what it actually was until I'm more confident about what the text actually has to say.
Right. And the final question, I mean, both of these are from YouTube. The final question is from Ivan Taylor. I have a clarifying I have a clarifying historical question. Would you say that the scholastic view of substances being unrecoverable after combination was generally the opinion of alchemists leading up to the 14th century?
Terrific question. I'm actually working on that. That's another thing I'm working on right now. And here's what I have to say about this. I think when we think about scholastic Aristotelianism, we're generally thinking about the Thomistic interpretation that was put forth predominantly by the Dominicans or at the University of Paris. But from what I can tell from reading John and some of the people that he heard speak or that he read while he was in Toulouse, there seems to be a slightly different interpretation of scholastic Aristotelianism, particularly among the Franciscans, and particularly in the Occitan region, in the southern region, as opposed to the north. So this is a terrific question, and I think it bears on a major question of why is it there are so many Franciscan alchemists and so few Dominican ones? I think it's because the Franciscans had a different idea of matter theory, of a different way of interpreting Aristotle to talk about matter theory that, and in a sense, made alchemy more possible than it could have been from a purely Thomistic perspective on Aristotle.
Okay, and I think with that really, really interesting historiographical point, I will draw a line on the seminar. The next seminar in this series will be on the 24th of September, and details will be sent out in the usual way. And can I just remind everybody that the SHAC autumn/fall meeting will be at the Deutsches Museum in Munich on the 5th and 6th of November. And if you want to contribute a paper, send it to me by the end of play on Sunday, and then we announce the program shortly thereafter. And also on the 25th of January, we will be marking jointly with the Royal Society of Chemistry Historical Group the 400th birthday of Robert Boyle in the new style calendar rather than the old style calendar, which would have meant meeting would have been very early in the new year, which nobody thought was a good idea. Okay, so with that, it just remains for me to thank everybody involved in running this seminar. That's Ian Tao and Rob Johnson, but most of all, Larry Principe for giving us a really, really interesting talk. And I'm very much looking forward to reading the book, which should be out soon.
Yes,
so
a few weeks.
2 weeks. 2 weeks.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Okay, well, that went extremely well, I thought, I have to say.
Thank you so much, Frank, for taking care of it, and thank you, Rob, for helping all out with this, and thank you.
Iran's the real one behind it all. I've just been taking the credit.
Well, many